Chapter 1 of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel by Gerard F Scriven, W.F. Foreword. Have you thought very much about your guardian angel? Have you wondered about his size, or about the feel of his wings, or how closely he walks beside you, or what he does when you are asleep? We have asked many boys and girls these questions, and everyone gives us different answers. One little girl likes to think of her angel dressed in a fluffy blue gown and gold slippers, but her brother quickly disagreed. "Ah, he can't wear that if he goes fishing with me." Actually, your guardian angel is a pure spirit. Pure means that he is all spirit and has no body. It is hard for us human beings to imagine what a spirit really is, and it is much easier for us to think of angels as having bodies. So in this book Wopsy is like a lovable human being, and no matter what picture you have in mind about your guardian angel, he acts more or less like Wopsy. He is busy day and night, loving God as hard as he can by taking good care of you. Chapter 1. Taking Charge. Now there was in heaven a very small angel whose name was Wopsy. This wasn't really an angel's name, for such names are usually beautiful. He was called Wopsy because even the archangels had a hard time remembering his real name, which had 14 letters. Ever since Wopsy could remember, and he had a very good memory for such a small angel, he had spent all his time loving God. Then one day God called him by his long and beautiful name, and Wopsy paid attention quickly because it was so unusual. God said, "You are going to be a guardian angel and watch over people as well as loving me." When Wopsy heard this he just couldn't help clapping his hands, which were angel hands of course, and made a beautiful sound like little silver bells tinkling. You see, he had always envied, in quite an angelic sort of way, of course, the important angels who guarded people from harm and from big and little devils. Wopsy wasn't a bit afraid of devils, for whom he had a great contempt, quite out of proportion to his size. Then God told Wopsy that because he was only small and without any experience, he would have to start guarding a very small person, in fact, just a baby who lived in Africa. Wopsy was so excited. "Oh, how lovely!" cried Wopsy, and his hands tinkled and tinkled. He loved black babies. All the little angels did, because they had big white eyes and such a beautiful shiny black skin. "May I call him Shiny?" asked Wopsy at once, and God said he could call him anything he liked because he had only a horrible pagan name which meant "he who eats too much." Besides, God said he hoped that if Wopsy looked after him well, he who eats too much would one day be baptized and have a lovely Christian name. So Wopsy flew off, his wings making a noise like butterflies when they are happy. First he flew to see some important guardian angels who were not busy just then, but who had lots of experience, and he asked them for some tips. They gave him so many that Wopsy got them all mixed up and had to spend quite a time straightening them out. When all was ready at last and the ideas were all neatly stored away between the feathers of his wings, Wopsy flew off and slid right down a moonbeam because he was a very happy little angel, and landed right in front of the hut where "he who eats too much" lived with his parents. Wopsy clapped his hands outside the door, but no one came, so he went right through the door as angels do, and looked for the black baby. "Oh dear," he said, "what an awful place to live in, and wherever are you, Shiny?" Just then he heard a tiny noise under a piece of cloth in the corner, and there he found the tiniest black baby he had ever seen. "Oh," said Wopsy, "what a lovely black baby, and how beautifully shiny!" Then he kissed him with an angel's kiss which made the baby stop making a noise at once. It opened its eyes, and Wopsy looked right down into its soul. But suddenly Wopsy trembled and nearly fell over with horror, for right down in the soul of Shiny he saw nothing but darkness, and he knew it was caused by original sin. "Oh dear," said Wopsy, "I must try to change that." Then he went outside and sat on a stone to think. But as soon as he sat down he started loving God as hard as he could, because he knew that was the best way to find out what to do. Poor Wopsy! It had been a shock to find that the soul of a black baby was as black as its skin. Wopsy had never seen a soul like that before. They didn't have any like that in heaven. It made him feel quite poorly for a minute or two. Of course, it wasn't Shiny's fault that his soul was black. But there it was, and it did seem a shame. He really must do something about it. For quite a long time Wopsy sat and loved God as hard as he could. Then he sprang up and flew off to do some exploring. First of all, though, he took another peep at Shiny to make sure he was safe and sound and sleeping peacefully. Then he was off, in and out of the trees, over the fields and hills, seeing what he could do. What a lot of queer beasts there were prowling about under the trees! They were so wonderful, especially the lions and the elephants, that Wopsy simply had to stop on a tree and praise God about them for a bit. Just to be on the safe side, and because he felt it his duty, Wopsy flew back to Shiny for a minute. It didn't take him long to get there, because small angels have a simply marvelous way of getting about even when there are no moonbeams to slide down. He arrived just in time to chase away 2 enormous beetles and a spider that were going to wake Shiny up and make him scream. Then he flew off again, back over the trees, faster than any bird, until he came to a village, where he had a peep at lots of black men and women all fast asleep. Wopsy was glad to see all these people so quiet and good. He said to himself, "If they're all like that, they can't be very difficult to look after." But another guardian angel with lots of experience, who happened to be passing, said, "You wait till they all wake up. Honestly, you never saw such a crowd." Wopsy didn't stay to have a chat, although he would have liked to, for you see he had to get his bit of exploring done before daybreak. Off he flew again till he saw another village in the distance. Then suddenly his wings fluttered and trembled, his eyes danced with real angel joy, and with a song of happiness he flew straight towards a tiny building where a little lamp was burning. Before you could say Jack Robinson, he was inside and dancing about, tinkling his hands and fluttering his wings. Then he knelt down and bowed very low and was quiet for a long time. He was just loving God as hard as he could, and thinking about Shiny with the black soul that didn't shine at all. Presently he sprang up, waved his hand to say good-bye, and flew off over the trees again. It was nearly morning now, and the tree tops were full of brightly colored birds singing away as hard as they could. It seemed to Wopsy that they were all loving God too, and that made him very happy. So he sat for a minute on the topmost branch of a tree, and tinkled his hands together, and sang his own song about loving God. It was a wonderful song. Now it sounded just like the nightingale in the evening, now like a little stream chasing through the reeds and tumbling over the stones, now like a little breeze playing in the leaves. But all the time there was another part which was more quiet and beautiful, and that was the real angel part of the song. When morning came and the sun peeped through the trees, Wopsy flew back to the hut to keep an eye on Shiny. He sat down beside him and went on singing his angel song, thinking what a pity it was that Shiny couldn't sing it too. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel by Gerard F Scriven, W.F. Chapter 2. A Very Happy Little Angel. Ordinarily, Wopsy wasn't too busy. There were beetles and spiders to be kept away from Shiny. There were snakes that had to be coaxed in another direction. There were sunstroke and fever mosquitoes to be avoided. But that was all in the day's work. One thing, however, did bother Wopsy very much, and that was Shiny's soul. If he had been a worrying sort of person, which angels never are, Wopsy would certainly have been in a dreadful state. I suppose bigger guardian angels were used to unbaptized souls, but Wopsy wasn't, and he meant to do something about it. So whenever he loved God, and that was all the time really, Wopsy brought up the question of Shiny's soul. One day when Shiny was playing about on the ground in front of the hut, making mud pies, he suddenly got tired of his pies, as babies do, and looked round for something else to play with. All at once he clapped his hands with joy and toddled towards a fire which was burning in a hole. Cooking pots were standing near it. When Shiny got near, he leaned over the hole and stretched out his hands to the flames. Wopsy was watching and was just going to call the baby away with an angel song when he heard God speaking. God told Wopsy to leave Shiny to himself. Now, if Wopsy hadn't been an angel, he would not have understood what God was saying. But he knew for sure that God would not let anything happen to Shiny if it were not really good for him. Wopsy just loved God a bit harder and watched. Shiny leaned over with little gurgles of happiness. Then suddenly he slipped and fell headlong into the fire. In a minute he was all afire. He began to scream as hard as ever a baby could. His mother, Nucka Nucka, rushed out of the hut and grabbed him by his toes, which seemed to be the only part of him that was not alight. Quickly she wrapped a big piece of cloth around him to put out the flames, but poor Shiny was terribly burned. Wopsy sat there motionless, feeling very sorry for Shiny, but trusting God as hard as he could. He saw Nucka Nucka fetch a wooden bowl with oil and pour it all over Shiny, who was very quiet now and seemed to be asleep. Suddenly Wopsy heard God whispering to him again, and listened very carefully. A most wonderful angel smile came to Wopsy's face, and he clapped his hands again and again. Then he bowed his wings in adoration for a few seconds, jumped up and flew off. Over the tree tops went Wopsy, gliding down the sunbeams to the forest streams, then tumbling over the surface of the water and down the waterfalls, for he was such a happy little angel. Soon he came to a group of buildings set in a garden, where children were playing. He had been here before, and he knew the building with the little lamps burning where God lived. This time, though, he did not go to the church, but to the house next door. First he peeped into a window on the ground floor, where he saw a man dressed all in white, wearing a long chain and cross around his neck. He was writing in a big book. "That's the one," said Wopsy to himself, and flew in through the window. Just then the missionary, for it was a missionary, got up to get another book from a shelf, and while he was getting it, Wopsy blew the pages of the big book over until he came to a page on which was written Matangu. Now Matangu was the name of the village where Shiny lived. The missionary came back, sat down, and caught sight of the name on the open page. "Oh," he thought, "I'd almost forgotten Matangu." And he read what was written beneath. Then he got up and told another priest in another room that he had just remembered he had not been to Matangu for a long time, and he must really go and see the people there that very day. Wopsy smiled and sang and clapped his hands as he watched the missionary get his motor bike ready. Then he followed the priest along the forest paths. When they got near the house where Nucka Nucka lived, right at the edge of the village, Wopsy suddenly bent down and did something to the motor bike, which gave a gasping noise and then stopped. "I wonder what's wrong now," said the missionary as he got down to have a look. At that very moment Nucka Nucka came out of her hut. She saw the priest and came running over, crying, "Bwana, Bwana, come at once, my baby is burned." "Oh," said the missionary, "that's why the engine stopped here, is it?" Then he took a little box from the back of the machine and went over to the hut. He very gently lifted Shiny up and began to unwrap him. Then he got some ointment from his box and some cotton and bandages and wrapped Shiny up again till he looked like a baby mummy. Wopsy was watching carefully, and his eyes shining like stars. He drew near and whispered something in the missionary's ear. Then the priest took another good look at Shiny. "Yes," thought the missionary, "this is a pretty sick little baby. He may die." Then he took another little bottle and some cotton from the box. Wopsy came near and knelt down while his wings trembled with happiness. As the missionary bent over Shiny, he said some words in Latin. Wopsy understood the words of baptism, and he heard the word John. He jumped up and bent over Shiny to look down through his eyes into his soul. How lovely it was now! Gone was all the stain of original sin. Shiny's soul was beautiful and clean. The missionary smiled at Shiny, said goodbye to his mother, and went off to his motor bike again. To his surprise it started right away, so he set off down the road to Matangu, very happy and pleased. But Wopsy, having seen that Shiny had gone quietly to sleep, flew off to heaven to see an important angel who kept the big books of heaven, with whom he now had some business. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel, by Gerard F Scriven, W.F. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 3. What happens at night? Most people think that a guardian angel stops working for the night when the person he is taking care of is safely asleep. But what does he do? Does he just fly off to heaven to get orders for the next day and see that all the entries in the big book are correct? Of course, he has to do this, but it doesn't take all night by any means, for angels are very quick about everything. They think nothing of popping up to heaven while you are taking a deep breath. Many people go to bed feeling very sad and wretched. Perhaps they have had to say goodbye to someone they love very much, or perhaps their children have been unkind to them. At night their guardian angel helps them to get to sleep quietly, and then he strokes their forehead with his angel hands to smooth their cares away. They wake up in the morning feeling quite happy again. That's only one of the things an angel does. There are many other things to do at night too. Devils are particularly active at night, though you might not think so. Of course, one of the worst devils is the midday devil, who never comes out at night. But there is also one called the Business, who walks in the darkness. Wopsy had an encounter with the Business one night soon after Shiny had been burned so badly. He had left Shiny sleeping peacefully, having a pleasant dream about mud pies, and went off to have a look round the forest. He loved doing this. There were so many exciting things to see. He flew up into the trees and peeped into the nests of the birds to see that all the little ones were snuggled up warm. He peeked beneath the ant hills and saw them all asleep in their dormitories. He played hide and seek with the owls and other birds which keep late hours. He slipped up and down the moonbeams and listened to the song of the waterfalls that don't keep any hours at all. Sometimes he heard the song of the nightingale, which he turned into love of God and sent up to heaven. On this particular night Wopsy had done all these things when suddenly he knew, in a way that guardian angels know, that Shiny was in danger. Quickly he shot across the sky back to the hut where his black baby lived. Yes, as he suspected, the Business, who walks in the darkness, was prowling around. First of all, the Business made sure there were no holy water fonts or blessed candles about, things he couldn't stand. Then he sneaked into the hut, trying to keep out of the light of the moonbeams. Wopsy saw him, however, because he was blacker than any other part of the night, and followed him in. The Business crept up to Naka Naka, Shiny's mother, and started putting ideas into her head. Dreadful ideas they were. You see, the Business was downright provoked that Shiny had been baptized, and now wanted to be rid of Shiny before he grew up and received instructions from the missionary. So the Business was suggesting that Shiny had been so badly burned that he would never really get well again, but would always be ugly and deformed. The Business was suggesting that the best thing to do with a black baby who was badly burned was to leave him out in the forest for the lions to take away, otherwise the spirits of Naka Naka's ancestors would haunt her and make her ill. Of course, this all sounds very silly, but Shiny's mother was a pagan, and it was not unusual for pagans to throw their sick children away because they were afraid of their ancestors. Just as if a grandmother or a grandfather would want to do anybody any harm. When Wopsy heard the suggestions the Business was making, he became very cross and indignant. Fancy throwing his Shiny John to the lions! The idea! Quickly he went into the hut where the baby lay and began to shine, first like a tiny glowworm, then brighter and brighter until the sun seemed to have come into the hut. When Wopsy began to shine, the Business simply faded away until he disappeared altogether. This goes to prove that even the biggest devils can be got rid of, if only you set about it in the right way. As soon as he had gotten rid of the Business, Wopsy, turning to Naka Naka, stroked her forehead very gently to smooth away all the fears of spirits and ancestors. Then he whispered to her that Shiny would get quite well again if she took good care of him. He said that Shiny was a very lovable little baby and that he might grow up to be a fine, strong man who would be useful to his mother. All this and much more Wopsy told Naka Naka. In the end she had a lovely dream about Shiny growing up and becoming a Bwana missionary like the white men. When Naka Naka woke up in the morning, she only remembered the nice dream. So she went over to Shiny and kissed him, and whispered that she would take good care of him so that he would be a Bwana one day. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel by Gerard F Scriven, W.F. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 4. Wopsy goes off on business. Naka was worried about Shiny at times, but she carefully followed the instructions of the Bwana missionary, and little by little Shiny got well again. No one was more pleased than Wopsy, who helped with angel medicine. Since this was the first time he was a guardian angel to anybody, he didn't want it to end so quickly, especially as Shiny was now baptized and could be called John. Shiny became well and strong and continued to get bigger and fatter, as all babies do when fed right. Wopsy simply loved to look deep down in Shiny's eyes and see God in his soul. He saw other things there too. There were the virtues of faith, hope, and charity, very small of course, but shining quite clearly. Wopsy did so want these virtues to grow big and strong. But Shiny's mother, being a pagan, wouldn't be any help. She meant well, of course, but it never occurred to her to teach Shiny his prayers. She didn't know any herself. She had never heard of Jesus and Mary because she had never been to the mission, and the missionaries didn't often come her way. Wopsy called to the guardian angel of Naka and asked him to keep an eye on Shiny for a bit, as he had to go rather a long way on important business. "Mind he doesn't fall into the fire, and see he does what his mother tells him," Wopsy said. The other angel smiled, because he knew Wopsy was rather particular about Shiny, and told him not to worry. Wopsy flew straight to a house on the outskirts of a big town. It was a fairly big house with a large garden, but Wopsy didn't stop to admire the flowers. He went at once to peep in the windows. He saw a little boy reading by the fire in an armchair. The boy was about 9, and he was chuckling to himself as he read the story called Peter Pan and Wendy. Wopsy flew into the room through the wall as angels do, and peeped at the book. Then he laughed too. For after all, he said to himself, Peter Pan was something like me. For a few moments Wopsy sat in another armchair with his wings tucked away. Then he nodded and smiled and said to himself, "Just the sort of boy for me." Having obtained permission from the boy's own guardian angel, Wopsy flew over and started whispering behind the boy. He wasn't really saying words, for angels don't need to, but if we could put it into words, this is what it would be. Yes, Peter Pan was a nice boy, but he wasn't really very useful, was he? He didn't do much to help other people, did he? Have you ever thought of helping other people? Yes, I know you have, because you told Mother you wanted to be a priest some day, and priests are always helping other people. Well, I want to tell you about some people who need helping very badly. Out in Africa there are many poor pagans who don't know anything about God, and they've never heard about Jesus and Mary, because there aren't enough priests to teach them. These pagans have no idea how to get to heaven. Don't you think you might perhaps be a missionary and go and help them? Later that evening Wopsy flew back to the little boy's house again. The curtains were drawn, but Wopsy flew in anyway. There he saw Mother knitting and Father reading a book. Suddenly Mother looked up and said, "Has John said anything to you about being a missionary?" Father looked up and shook his head. Quickly Wopsy went behind him and started whispering in his ear. Mother went on, "He came to me this evening and asked me if I should mind much if he went away to Africa to teach the pagans. I didn't tell him that I've been praying for that ever since he was a baby. I just said we'd have to think about it." She looked rather anxiously at Father. Father sat gazing into the fire, not seeming to notice that the little angel was still whispering in his ear. At first he looked worried, but after a few moments he shook his head again and smiled. "Well," he said, "I had hoped we should be able to keep him at home, but if God wants him, there is nothing more to be said about it. But he is very young and will have to wait." Wopsy didn't stay to hear any more. He darted around and kissed them both, which made them feel very happy, although they didn't know why. Then he was off again. He had several more houses to visit, and he had to pop into church again to get directions. When he had made all his calls, he flew high up over the clouds and flashed across the sky. People looking up said, "There's a shooting star," but they didn't know the star was a guardian angel flying in the sky. In less than no time Wopsy was back at Matangu, where Shiny lived. The big guardian angel he had left in charge said, "You'll have to be careful. Shiny John is getting bigger, and he needs looking after most all the time. I saw a big devil hanging around yesterday. That's a sure sign. Take my advice and don't let him out of your sight." Wopsy said he wouldn't, and thanked the angel, and told the other angels all about his visits far away over the sea. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel by Gerard F Scriven, W.F. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 5. Wopsy Weeps Angel Tears. All was sunshine and cheerfulness in the forest. The birds were singing, the crickets were rubbing their back legs together, making no end of noise, as they always do when they are happy, and even the lions were purring in their dens. Shiny, or rather John, was growing to be a sturdy little black boy. Wopsy was busy these days, for John was always getting into mischief. Up to the present, however, he had never done anything really very naughty. On this bright summer day he was playing by himself in the forest, catching butterflies. Wopsy was catching them too, but they didn't mind being caught by him, for he always let them go again. It was just for fun. Nucka had told Shiny he could play as much as he liked among the trees, but that he must not eat any berries. Although he was small, Shiny understood quite well. He was an obedient little boy, and his mother always said that there wasn't another boy in the village like him. "Quite right," Wopsy would say to himself, "for he's the only one with a clean soul, and that makes a difference." One of the butterflies was very hard to catch, and Shiny chased it quite a long way. At last, when it came to rest on a bush covered with lovely red berries, Shiny almost had it. But it flew off again, and Shiny didn't go after it. He just stood and looked at the berries. At that very moment someone came towards him, dodging behind the trees, and looking rather fearfully to where Wopsy was sitting on a branch, with butterflies flying round his head. It was a peculiar looking creature, very big and bulky, in fact, almost bumpy, with two pointed things sticking out of its head, and a long tail trailing behind. Wopsy had noticed it, and was watching very carefully, although he pretended not to. He knew what this particular creature was, and why it looked as if it had once been very nice looking. Shiny continued to look at the berries, and the person came up and whispered in his ear, "Lovely berries! You can be sure they taste lovely too." To himself Shiny said, "Mummy said not to eat berries." The person whispered back, "Mummy won't know. She can't see." Quick as a flash Wopsy flew down. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," he cried. "A hulking devil like you coming to tempt a little boy like Shiny. I've heard of you, Pong. You are always going after children. Why don't you go after someone your own size?" Then he turned to Shiny and began to whisper in his other ear. But Shiny had already stretched out his hand, seized a branch of berries, and begun eating them as fast as he could. Pong was trembling all over, for the sight of a guardian angel always made him lose his nerve. But he began to chuckle too, a horrible chuckle like the rasp of a file on a piece of iron. Poor Wopsy! He was only a little angel, and this was the first time Shiny had done wrong. He was just able to whisper in Shiny's ear that he had better go home. Shiny seemed to hear and ran home. But Wopsy just sat on the ground, with his wings drooping in the dust, and big tears running down his cheeks. How could anyone be so naughty? Just then a big angel flew by and caught sight of Wopsy. He came down, put his arms around his shoulders, and comforted him. He knew what it was all about, of course, for angels don't really need to talk at all. They can understand each other. If he had spoken as we do, we would have heard this. "Never mind, Wopsy. I know it's hard the first time. But, you see, little boys are not angels, and they all do wrong sometimes. You mustn't worry too much about John, who is really a very good little boy. The best thing you can do is to go and make sure he is sorry about it, and then begin all over again. I know you will never get used to it. It hurts every time, but it's all part of our job." This comforted Wopsy a great deal, and he was really very happy inside. It's difficult to explain what goes on inside angels. They are so different from human beings, and even when they are sad and want to cry, they are not really unhappy. How can they be when they are so near to God? Wopsy soon became a happy little angel again and hurried off to make things right for Shiny. Poor Shiny! Wopsy found him lying in the hut with a very bad stomach ache, while his mother was explaining how hard she was going to thrash him when he got well again. Now it was Wopsy's turn to do something comforting, and he did it very well. Soon he had Shiny feeling sorry for having been disobedient and almost forgetting about the stomach ache. This was just what Wopsy wanted, and when he was sure Shiny was quite sorry, he flew off to heaven to see the important angel who keeps the books, to make quite sure that he had got the whole affair down correctly. He was specially careful to explain the share Pong had had in the matter. "Yes," said the big angel, "I have had a lot of complaints about Pong lately. I must speak to Michael about him." End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel by Gerard F Scriven, W.F. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 6 The Wanglings of Wopsy. That affair with Pong and the berries made Wopsy very thoughtful for some days afterwards. Of course it hadn't been a very serious affair really, but Pong was sure to hang about again, like the wicked devil he was, and what could a little fellow like Shiny do against him? He was baptized, it was true, but he never said any prayers, he never went to church, and as things were, he wouldn't ever be able to go to confession and communion. No wonder his guardian angel was worried. Even an old, experienced angel might have been disturbed, but poor Wopsy was terribly upset. Something must be done about it, so first of all he went round to a number of other guardian angels who were working in the Matangu district and who might have some tips for him. One suggested that Shiny might die young and go straight to heaven. Wopsy agreed this might happen, but he had other ideas for his John. Another angel said that if his mother and father died, the missionaries might come and take Shiny as an orphan. This was not a bad idea, but Wopsy didn't want John's mother and father to die just yet. They were still unbaptized, and he knew their guardian angels wouldn't like it at all. The third suggestion was best. More missionaries simply must come to Matangu and build a church and a house and live there. Then he, Wopsy, would easily be able to arrange for Shiny to go to catechism and be brought up a little Christian. One fine afternoon, when Shiny was busy eating the lunch his mother had given him, Wopsy flew off over the trees to the distant village where the missionaries lived. Again there was a long line of big guardian angels waiting, but Wopsy wouldn't be put off this time. Wopsy found Father George sitting in his chair, looking very tired, and reading his breviary. He was just saying, "All ye angels of the Lord bless and exalt him forever." Wopsy read the words and knelt to bless and exalt the Lord himself. Then he went up and started whispering in the priest's ear, softly, while he went on with his prayers. When he had said what he wanted to Father George, Wopsy popped into the church, knelt down with his wings fluttering happily, and stayed quite still for a minute or two. Then he jumped up, blew a kiss to Jesus in the tabernacle — he was only a small angel — and flew off to see how Shiny was getting on. He found him quite happy and safe, so Wopsy flew off again to the mission. The priest had finished his prayers and was talking to another priest about villages that had to be visited. He was just saying, "It's a long time since we have been to Matangu, you know. You remember there's a baby there I baptized. I really ought to go and keep an eye on him. It's such a pity they are so far away from here." "Why not go tomorrow?" said the other priest. "You could take your tent and the boy, then go on from there to Mwango and Asangu and Pato, and still be back for Sunday." "But what a lot of work you will have while I'm away," said Father George. "There are the catechism classes and the confessions and sick calls. Besides, you're not really well yet. You still look a bit feverish." "Never mind that," said Father Superior. "You get off to Matangu and the other places. I'll manage all right." Wopsy clapped his hands till they tinkled and tinkled. Then he went up and hugged the two missionaries, who suddenly felt very happy without quite knowing why. Wopsy danced around and chatted with the other angels while Father George got everything ready. He seemed to take a long time. but, of course, he didn't know that an impatient little angel was waiting for him to start. Otherwise he would have hurried more. At last he was ready. There was an oblong box on the back of the motor bike, with a neat little altar in it, a folded tent for the missionary, and a negro helper named Michael sitting on top of the tent. There was a bang or two, then a whizzing noise, a cloud of dust, and Father George was off. So was the catechist, or very nearly, but he just managed to keep his seat. He was always a bit nervous when he went out with Father George. Of course, he couldn't guess that they had 3 guardian angels with them for this journey. The picky, as the native people called the motor bike, bounced along, past the fields of maize, through the banana plantations, across the rickety bridge over the river, then along narrow paths beneath the shade of giant trees. The forest grew thicker and thicker. Little monkeys scampered about among the trees, and all the air was filled with the hum of thousands of insects. Father George was used to all this, and he didn't take much notice. In fact, he was wondering whether he had remembered to put that spare piece of string in his pocket in case the exhaust pipe fell off as it had last time. The guardian angels were vigilant, however, because there were so many thorns in the way that might have punctured the tires, besides the holes that had to be avoided. Wopsy was lending a hand, but at the same time he was able to keep an eye on the forest and all the strange things that lived in it. After about an hour the narrow path plunged down into a valley. Father George drove down with not a worry in the world. He couldn't see that the guardian angels were looking quite concerned about something in front, but he did notice when Michael the catechist gave a shout that sounded loud above the noise of the engine. Yes, there was something on the path at the bottom of the valley, and it did look very much like a lion. Father George couldn't stop and turn round in time, and besides, he had to go to Matangu that afternoon. So he said a prayer to his angel, drove the bike as fast as it would go, and sounded his cracked old horn to scare the animal away. The bike went fast, but Wopsy and the other angels went faster. The lion was already very confused by this queer big noise that was rushing at him. It was quite a new sort of noise for him. Suddenly, when something he couldn't see got hold of his tail and pulled, he forgot about Father George and Michael for a minute. During that minute, Father George roared by and started climbing the opposite hill. Wopsy said to the other angels, "You look after them. I'll see to this." He hung on to the lion's tail as hard as he could. The lion turned round, looking most surprised and angry, but Wopsy didn't let go until the motor bike was almost out of sight. Then he let go the lion's tail, patted the lion on the tip of his nose, and told him to be a good boy and go home. The lion turned and went home like a lamb. As for Father George and Michael, they were a bit scared, but the priest just wiped his brow and thought of the good story he could tell when he got back to the mission. The rest of the journey was uneventful, except that the exhaust pipe did fall off and had to be tied on with a piece of string after all. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel, by Gerard F Scriven, W.F. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 7. Father George says Mass at Matangu. Wopsy had enjoyed the tug with the lion and flew on to prepare Naka and Shiny for the visitor. He flew quickly on to Matangu, leaving the puffing, chugging motorbike far behind. Shiny had long since finished eating, but the other animals assured Wopsy that they had taken good care of him in the meantime. Wopsy took one look deep into Shiny's eyes to make sure all was well, and it was. Naka was out in the fields working, but as soon as her guardian angel heard that Father George was on his way, he whispered into her ear, and she decided it was time to go home. She got back to her hut and found Shiny having a fight with another little boy. They were great friends, really, but they had to have a fight now and then to make life more interesting. Wopsy thought this was good for Shiny and didn't mind at all, but Naka gave them both a box on the ears and sent Shiny into the hut. Shiny didn't mind because he had been getting the worst of the fight. There came from the neighboring forest a succession of loud bangs, a roar like the sound of many lions, and a continuous rattling noise. It was Father George arriving. The birds of the forest did not know Father George, so they arose from the trees in flocks, twittering anxiously. Very few people in Matangu knew Father George's motorbike could make such noise, so they rushed to the shelter of their huts and prepared for the worst. it was a rather frightening noise, for the exhaust pipe had fallen off again and couldn't be found. There was a final roar, and Father George jumped off the bike to see if there was anything else missing. Slowly black heads peeped round the openings of huts. Then one by one the inhabitants came out, much relieved to see that here was no strange new beast, but only Father George and Piki Piki. An excited, chattering group gathered round the missionary. Each one found that he had something very important that he wanted to ask, while most of them discovered a pain somewhere which required urgent attention from the missionary's medicine box. Wopsy was there too, full of happiness because Father George had come, and because Mass was going to be offered next morning. Michael, the catechist, was happy too, because he had arrived safely in spite of the motor bike. He began putting up the tent at once. When it got dark, one by one the black heads were laid on the ground, which was all the pillow they needed. Father George lit a lamp and said his prayers before going to bed. Shiny, too, lay down in his hut, and Wopsy stroked Shiny's forehead to give him happy dreams as he fell asleep. Then he went to join in the song of the birds. It was to love and praise God that he did this, for he knew that the birds sing for no other reason. Presently even the nightingales went to sleep, and all the forest was silent. Wopsy sat on a tree top enjoying the moon and praising God. Next morning the sun shone through all the doors and windows of the forest. It shone on the nests of the birds and awakened them to a new day of song. It shone on the insects who began to buzz cheerily. It shone through the open doorways of the huts onto black heads that turned and went to sleep again. It shone in the tent of Father George, who rose to his knees and began to say his prayers. It awoke the catechist Michael, who jumped up and began to prepare the altar for Mass. Before the sleepy black heads had turned again, the sun was shining on the white habit of Father George, who was walking up and down making his morning meditation, thinking about God as he did every morning before saying Mass. Beneath the flap of the tent was a neat little altar. All was ready, and Father George started putting on his vestments. Very special ones they were, thin and light as a feather. There was no one at Mass but Father George and Michael, and yet there was a great crowd that couldn't be seen around that little altar, for all the guardian angels from miles and miles around came flocking there. Even a number of big angels had come down from heaven specially for the occasion. Of course Wopsy was there, with his angel heart full of gladness, for God Himself was to be present on this little altar. Holy Mass began, and the angels started taking the prayers up to heaven. Slowly and reverently Father George said Mass, and then came the great moment of the consecration. There was a hush among the angels, while even the birds of the forest seemed to still their song for a moment. A little bell tinkled, and all the angels bowed down, touching the ground with their wings. Never were there such happy angels, for this was the first time that Holy Mass had been offered at Matangu. When the priest raised his hands high, all that Michael could see was a snow-white host, but the angels saw much more. They could see our Blessed Lord Himself, just as they saw Him in heaven. Now the big angels who had come specially for Mass were busy carrying to heaven the prayers of Jesus Himself. They offered, too, His sacrifice for the people of the whole world, but specially for the people who lived at Matangu, and about whom nobody except Jesus and the angels and the missionaries cared very much. Wopsy was praying hard too, but, of course, he was thinking about Shiny and all that he wanted God to do for him. When Father George finished his thanksgiving after Mass, he had a little breakfast that Michael prepared for him. Then he went round to see the people who were all awake now. He went to see Naka Naka and Shiny and spoke to them for quite a long time. Wopsy was so proud he simply danced with excitement. Father George talked to them about God and about being good, and Naka Naka asked, "Why don't you come and live with us and tell us always more about God?" "We would," replied Father George, "if only there were more of us." When he had seen everyone, Father George sat down in the shade of a big tree and began to say his office. Wopsy sat down beside him and began whispering in his ear, for he knew God didn't mind angels whispering to missionaries while they were saying their prayers. It was all about Shiny and Matangu and Naka Naka, so that when the missionary got up to go, his mind was full of it all. The people crowded round to say goodbye, but they jumped out of the way quickly when the motor bike began to roar again. Father George couldn't stay. He had to go to Mwanga and Isangu and Pato and be back at the mission for Sunday. He wasn't quite sure that the motor bike would last, but it did, and on Saturday afternoon he arrived safely back at the mission. That evening Father George said to Father Superior: "The village of Matangu would make a splendid centre for a new mission. The people are unspoiled and would welcome us, and there is quite a large population within a few miles." "Yes," said Father Superior, "I've no doubt you're right. But you know how few men the Bishop has to send. Write to him if you like and see what he says." End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel by Gerard F Scriven, W.F. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 8. Wopsy and the Bishop. The bishop of the country around Matangu, that is, of Urubi Vicariate, lived in a palace in the little town by the lake. It wasn't a very splendid palace. The walls were made of bricks dried in the sun, and the roof was of corrugated iron sheets which the bishop found very noisy when the rain came down, and very hot when the sun beat upon them. Missionary bishops, however, are not particular, so he didn't mind. One day he was seated at his little table opening some letters that had come by the weekly mail. One of them was from Father George. As the bishop read it he began to smile to himself. "Here's another one of them," he was thinking, "always telling me about new villages full of likely Christians, chiefs who want missionaries, and people who are too far from the church. What can I do about it?" He was just going to toss the letter aside with a sigh when a small guardian angel flew in through the open window. He greeted the big guardian angel, who took care of the bishop, and then began at once whispering in the bishop's ear, while the big angel looked on and smiled. The bishop looked at the letter again, and went on thinking about it. He was saying to himself: "There's old Father John at Asanga, who is badly in need of a rest. And there's old Father Joseph at Poto, who can't carry on much longer and will simply have to be replaced. What's more, they'll probably only send one priest again this year." Wopsy went on whispering urgently, and he beckoned to the big angel to go to the bishop's other ear. The bishop hesitated for a moment. Then with another sigh he put Father George's letter aside and took up an envelope full of bills. Wopsy gave one hurt look at the bishop and then flew out of the window. He made straight for the cathedral, a sturdy building next door to the palace, flew straight inside and went up to the altar. He knelt down before the tabernacle, a very sad little angel. His wings were drooping, and you could almost see the tears in his eyes. He stayed near the altar quite a long time. He talked to our Lord about Shiny and Matangu and about the people who lived there. Then he suddenly jumped up and flew back to the bishop. Once more Wopsy began whispering in the bishop's ear, and his lordship stopped the work he was doing and looked out of the window. Wopsy waited a moment, and he heard the bishop say firmly: "No, it simply can't be done." If Wopsy hadn't been an angel he might easily have been discouraged. But again he flew straight over to the church and knelt down in front of the tabernacle. You see, even guardian angels don't always get what they want the first time they ask for it. He stayed there for about a half hour, this time hardly moving at all. He wasn't only asking for Shiny, he was also loving God as hard as he could, because he knew that was the best way to coax our Lord into giving him what he wanted, a mission at Matangu. At the end of the half hour he jumped up, clapped his hands with happiness, and blew a kiss to the tabernacle. Off to the palace again he went. The bishop was still sitting at his table with a lot of bills spread out before him and a nearly empty cash box beside him. Wopsy went up to the big guardian angel and told him what our Lord had said. The big guardian angel looked very pleased about it and smiled. Wopsy went up to the bishop and began telling him again about Matangu. Of course, the bishop did not know a little angel was talking to him, but he began to think about Father George's letter again, and he said to himself: "It's funny, I simply can't get Matangu out of my mind. Let me see. I was going to send the new priest to Mandana. That wouldn't leave anyone to spare. Even if I sent him to take Father George's place, there would be no one to go with Father George. Besides, there is the question of money. I simply can't do it just now. It can't be done unless the guardian angels help out and do something pretty quickly." Just at that moment a missionary came into the room holding 2 letters in his hand. "I am sorry, Bishop," he said, "but I found these among my own letters. They are for you." The bishop took the envelopes and opened them. As he did so a piece of paper fell out. He picked it up and saw it was a check for the sum of $1,000. He read the letter. Then he turned to Father Anthony and said, "This is the hand of God working. I was just thinking we couldn't possibly begin a mission at Matangu, and here some good persons send us $1,000 to start a mission. Now we only lack the priests. Where will we get them?" Then he looked at the other letter, and with wonder in his eyes turned to Father Anthony again and said, "Now just listen to this. They are not going to send us one man this year, but 3. That means we can certainly found a mission at Matangu. I think we shall have to thank the guardian angels for this very good news. They have certainly been busy." Wopsy, too happy to remain quiet, was clapping his hands until they tinkled again and again, just like little bells. He didn't stay there a minute longer, but flew back into the church to pay another visit and say thank you to God. Then he flew off over the hills and the forest back to Shiny. Of course, all this time he had not really neglected Shiny. Even when guardian angels go away, they manage to look after their charges at the same time. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel by Gerard F Scriven, W.F. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 9 Wopsy and the Poro Devil. Nuka was having an important conversation with some of her friends. At least you would have thought it was important. The black heads were so close together. Every now and then they would look around anxiously to see that no one was listening. No one was listening, for there was nobody anywhere near. But Nuka kept saying, "Don't talk so loud, they might hear." And every time she said this a frightened look came into the eyes of the other women, and their voices were hushed still more. "I've heard," said Maluya, in a thrilling whisper, "that there are people who leave their bodies when they are asleep, and then their spirits go about doing wicked things. They spoil the crops, and they creep into the huts and make people ill." "Oo," said the other women in chorus. "And sometimes," went on Maluya, "sometimes their spirits go into animals and birds, and they attack people and other animals. Once I heard of a man in the village where I used to live who became a leopard every night and killed people in other villages. Then one night a leopard was killed in the next village, and when we went to the man's hut in the morning we found that he was dead too, and that proved it." "Yes," said Nuka, nodding her curly black head wisely. "The words of Maluya are true words. But there are some who are worse than the leopard men. I have heard," and she looked all around fearfully, "that the Poro Devil is in the woods these days." "Ah, woo eh!" exclaimed the other women. "There is a man in this village," went on Nuka, "who has scars on his face and on his back. I believe they are the marks of the Poro Devil, and I think he is a Poro man. That means that we must be careful about the children. The other day I was coming back through the forest with my little boy, and I know that man was in front of us. Suddenly there was a whistle in the bushes, and he whistled too. I am sure that if I hadn't been there, the Poro Devil would have taken my boy away, and I shouldn't have seen him again till he came back with cuts and scars on his face and back. Then he would have been a Poro man. The Poro Devil doesn't walk like a man. He comes flying over the bushes, whistling and howling. He's off with the boy before you can look round. Be careful these days." Indeed, Nuka was so worried that she called Shiny over and warned him about going into the woods when it was dark. The other women got up and went off to cook their husbands' banana suppers. Wopsy was glad Nuka had warned Shiny about the Poro Devil, who was really a man possessed by the devil. Wopsy wasn't worried about the other spirits the black women had talked about. He was sure that some day the good missionaries would teach these people about superstitions, but the Poro Devil was different. Some days after this Shiny went off into the forest with a friend of his called Majinja. They wandered on until they came to where the path divided. Shiny wanted to go one way and Majinja wanted to go the other, so they had a fight about it. As neither really won, they separated and each took a different path. Wopsy didn't mind the fight. Shiny was always having fights. But he was a bit anxious when Shiny set off along the path by himself. Shiny didn't know where that path went, but Wopsy did, and he didn't like it. Wopsy even whispered in Shiny's ear, but the boy didn't take any notice. Wopsy began to get very worried and began flitting about the forest. The path where Shiny walked was narrow, and you couldn't see more than a yard into the dense forest on either side. But Wopsy saw everything. He went to see where the lions were, and the snakes, so that they should not go near Shiny. Farther on beside the path he saw something that made him more anxious than ever. He watched carefully for a minute, then he looked at Shiny, who was still hurrying along the path. Wopsy flew off quickly through the trees and stopped only when he came to a den in the ground. Shiny hurried on, not quite knowing where he was going, still thinking of what he ought to have done to Majinja. Suddenly, however, there was a peculiar whistle in the bush just beside him. He stopped, suddenly frightened, but before he had time to do anything, a pair of strong black arms caught him round the waist, and he felt himself being carried off. He cried and shrieked, but there was nobody in the forest to hear him. When Wopsy came to a certain den, he looked carefully for a minute, watching 4 great eyes that shone in the darkness within. He went in boldly and saw a lion and a lioness lying there, with 4 cubs playing around them. He went up to the lion, an enormous one it was, and whispered in his ear, for angels know how to talk to lions. The lion growled softly and began moving his great tail, then suddenly stood up and roared. It was a tremendous roar. At once there was a great silence in the forest. All the birds stopped singing, the monkeys stopped chattering, all the 4-footed beasts who heard stood still and looked all round with big, frightened eyes. At the same time, on the forest path, a strange man with scars on his face and back stopped for an instant and then hurried on quickly, while the small boy under his arm became suddenly silent. Wopsy whispered once more to the lion, who roared again, and then padded softly out of the den into the forest. Wopsy sometimes flew in front of the lion, sometimes he held on to the lion's tail and flew along behind, sometimes he stepped on the lion's back and had a ride. On went the lion, while the timid things of the forest scampered away on either side. But they need not have been afraid. The lion wasn't looking for them. Straight on he went, gliding through the tall grasses, jumping through the hanging creepers like a great cat. Yet hardly a sound did he make. On he went till he came near the forest path. Then he crept even more quietly than before. Suddenly he threw his head back and gave a mighty roar. The scarred man, who happened to be quite near on the path, gave a great leap, dropped Shiny, and rushed off up the path. For an instant the lion stood still, swishing his great tail backwards and forwards. Then he leaped into the air. But the black man leaped too, and the lion just missed him. The man gave another leap onto the branch of a tree and climbed up as quickly as he could. The lion came and sat under the tree, while his tail gently brushed the ground behind him. Meanwhile, Shiny was running as fast as he could in the other direction. He ran on and on, while Wopsy flew along overhead. Suddenly the forest thinned and came to an end, and Shiny knew he was back at his own village. It was a very quiet Shiny who crept into the hut, resolved that he would never again go into the forest alone. He didn't know who had frightened him the most, the big man or the lion. He couldn't know yet that it was his own guardian angel who had brought the lion. Could he? End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel by Gerard F Scriven, W.F. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 10 When Angels Meet. Shortly after the affair of the Poro man, the guardian angels of Matangu village arranged to have a meeting. They didn't really need to have one, for they could manage things quite well without. But angels, just like human beings, love to get together now and then and discuss things, especially when anything important is going to happen. And something important was going to happen at Matangu. Only the angels and the bishop knew at the moment what it was. But there was already a letter in the mail to Father George. The angels were keeping an eye on that letter, for it meant a great deal to them. If you had been there, and if you could have understood the angel talk, this is what you would have heard. "We've all heard the good news," began the angel. "Wopsy there seems to have managed it all, and I must say that for such a small angel he has done remarkably well. In a few weeks' time the missionaries will be here, and we shall be able to rest a bit. But between now and then there will be much to do. Has anyone noticed anything special lately?" "Yes, of course," answered one of the other angels. "The devils are particularly busy, trying to make the most of the time that's left to them, because it'll be harder afterwards. I've met the business that walks about in the darkness quite often lately, skulking in the shadows. Thank goodness we managed to make him fade away each time before he did any real harm. And then there's that fellow Pong, who's always going after the children, put in another Angel. If he weren't such a great coward, he would do a lot of harm. And I've actually caught the midday devil, added a fourth Angel, actually collecting fever mosquitoes and spreading them about the place to make the missionaries ill. I had quite a time blowing them all away again. "There's still going to be trouble," said Wopsy very seriously. "You may be sure the devils will do all they can to spoil things at the beginning. We shall all have to help the angels of the missionaries." "That is an important point," agreed someone. "We must make sure that things go well at the beginning. Some of the people here will be only too anxious to help the devils all they can. I actually caught one of the devils wondering whether a missionary would make good eating. I shall watch him very closely. Because Wopsy should have the least trouble with Shiny, he had better watch out for any strange devils. You never know who might turn up these days." That was what the angels were saying at their meeting, or something like it. It is very difficult to put down angel talk so that we can understand it. Many other things they said too, but which we wouldn't understand at all. The most important part of the meeting came at the end, when they all praised and thanked God together because the missionaries were coming at last. You never saw such a happy crowd of angels. The song of praise that they sang went straight to heaven like the smoke from the incense in church, so that the angels in heaven looked down on Matangu to see what was happening. Of all the angels at the meeting, Wopsy was the happiest, for he was the only one who had a black baby with a clean soul to look after, and he had worked so hard to get the missionaries to Matangu. Perhaps now the dream that he had dreamed in his angel mind about Shiny and the plans that he had made for himself might come true. What those plans were could not be told yet, for they were still Wopsy's own secret. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel by Gerard F Scriven, W.F. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 11. Wopsy and the Meeting of the Devils. Wopsy took very seriously his new duty of being on the lookout for any strange devils that might pop up in the neighborhood. This was quite an important commission for an angel who was, after all, rather small. Often during the days that followed, Wopsy flew around Matangu, peering in all the holes and corners where devils might be expected to linger. Nothing happened for some days, and the angels began to think that the devils hadn't heard what was happening. One evening, when all the people of Matangu had gone to sleep and even the birds of the forest had retired for the night, Wopsy sat on a high tree, watching the stars peep out one by one. It seemed to Wopsy that each one was singing a little song as it came out, until they all joined together in one great choir. The song was one of praise to God who had made them. It wasn't a real song, however, until the angels joined in and sent it up to heaven. Suddenly Wopsy's wings began to flutter anxiously. Something was moving down below among the creepers, something that had no right to be there. There seemed to be shadows moving in one direction. Wopsy was not afraid of being seen, for he knew that devils never look up to heaven. It gives them a headache. He flew along quietly in and out of the trees. At last the shadows came to a part of the forest where the branches looked green and horrible, and there was a smell of mold in the air. Dark shadows were now coming from other directions too, until there were quite a number grouped together in that part of the forest. Even the animals of the jungle seemed to know that something was going on, for you could hear the scampering of little feet and the fluttering of anxious wings as the animals and insects hastened away. Wopsy came closer to look, careful that his light should not shine down below. Yes, it was as he had thought. There was to be a meeting of the devils. There were many strange and horrible faces among them, some of which Wopsy recognized. There was the Business, for instance, uglier than all the others. There was Pong, as bumpy and awkward looking as ever. There was the Midday Devil, tall and thin and pale. In one corner, making faces at the others, sat an impudent little devil called Conk, small but full of craftiness. At the base of one of the trees sat 3 very important looking devils. That is to say, they looked much more horrible and ugly than the others, and that is how you know an important devil. Wopsy wasn't a bit afraid, For one small angel is equal to any number of devils, no matter how horrible they are. Suddenly there was a noise like the rasping of a file. It was a big devil speaking. "Brother devils," he said, "brave Pong and wily Conk, devils of the midday and of the night, devils of Matangu, the dreaded day has come at last. Now the missionaries are starting a mission in Matangu." A shudder went around the assembly, and there was a chorus of groans, hisses, and grunts. Horns trembled and hoofs shifted fearfully. "We have tried," went on the big devil. "We have done all that devils can do. I called upon the poisonous snakes to bite the missionaries. I summoned the lions to maul them. I tried to make the missionaries lazy and selfish. But I could do nothing while their angels were protecting them." At the word "angels" another shudder went through the group, and all the devils looked around fearfully. None saw Wopsy. "Our plan is this," continued the leader. "We will wait until the missionaries are here before we shall stir up the witch doctors and the devil worshippers." While much more like this was said, Wopsy listened and sang a little song of the love of God by himself. He had no fear of the devils. He was sad that they should work so wickedly against God, but he knew that God would win in the end. Of course, on the other hand, if there were no devils about, it would be too easy to get to heaven. People wouldn't earn such high places there, so there was some consolation even in devils. Wopsy soon decided that he had heard enough of their plans, and that it was time to chase the devils back where they could do no harm for the present. He uncovered his face and began to glow like a star. It was the business who noticed Wopsy first, for he felt himself fading out slowly, which was very embarrassing for a devil. The others looked at what was left of him in horror. Then they, too, saw the light streaming down from the treetop. One by one the devils turned and slunk away like rats. As soon as they left the light, they ran as fast as they could with their tails between their legs. Wopsy amused himself by chasing first one, then another, until they were all miles away from Matangu. The three big devils he chased all the way to the deserts of Upper Egypt. "What a crowd!" said Wopsy to himself as he flew back. He was not afraid of their coming back at once, because an angel's light gives a devil a headache for weeks afterwards. Soon there was no one left in Matangu but the village people sleeping soundly and their guardian angels. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel by Gerard F Scriven, W.F. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 12 On the Road to Matangu. Through the forests surrounding the village of Matangu ran a number of little paths, winding round and round like great serpents. In the old days these paths had often echoed to the tread of savage tribes in search of other heads to stick up on poles around the village. One fine morning in June, when the sun was already high in the sky, feet were again heard marching and voices were raised in song. It was not a war song this time. It was a song all about Father George and his belongings. Ay, ya, he is a great man. He brings medicine that jumps. He has a box that talks. He has a beast that goes picky picky. Ay, ya, he is a great man. Ay, ya, and his boxes are heavy. Ay, ya, his boxes are heavy. To understand what this meant, you must know that Father George had some rather powerful remedies in his medicine box, that he had a little victrola, that he had a motor bike, and the song being sung was that of the porters bringing all that was needed for the new mission. It is not quite true to say that the boxes held all that was needed, for lots of things that were really needed Father George just didn't have and couldn't possibly afford to buy. But Father George didn't mind. He was driving along on his motor bike in the forest, and his heart was glad because he was coming to start a new mission. Wopsy was also glad, very glad, for was he not guardian of the only Christian in all Matangu village, and had he not had a lot to do with the coming of Father George? Of course, all the guardian angels for miles around were excited, but Wopsy was most excited of all. Every few minutes he flew off across the forest, taking a peep at the black porters to make sure they didn't drop any of the boxes, or watching Father George chugging away on the motor bike. It was quite a problem for the angels to keep that motor bike going. There were so many bits and pieces that might fall off at any minute. Father George's own guardian angel was quite glad to have a helping hand now and then to make sure the machine didn't stop altogether. On went the black porters, on went Father George, disturbing things in the forest, small creepy things such as brightly colored beetles and big hairy spiders, small timid animals such as squirrels and mice, large fierce animals such as lions and leopards. They did not know anything about the new mission yet, but one of the small beetles bit the leg of a little antelope not far from the black porters, and the little antelope ran off into a dark part of the forest, near the lair where the lions lived. One big lion with an enormous mane was feeling rather hungry just then, so he growled and started off to have a talk with the antelope. And the antelope ran faster than ever, back to where the porters were marching and singing. Just as, for the 87th time, the porters had got to the line, "He has a beast that goes picky picky," they heard a huge roar close behind them in the forest. Their song stopped suddenly. The porters gave one frightened look in the direction of the roar. Then, without any hesitation at all, they started off as hard as they could go. You will be wondering what happened to the luggage. Well, if Wopsy hadn't been flying by just then, goodness knows what would have happened to it. For the men just threw it down on the ground. Certainly some of the boxes would have broken and all the glass would have cracked if Wopsy hadn't caught each box as it fell and deposited it safely on the ground. He had to be rather quick, of course, to do this, but he managed it quite easily. He couldn't help smiling at these men, for he was sure that the lion much preferred antelope meat to human meat for his lunch. That was why the lion did not stay, but went off after the antelope. Wopsy meanwhile took a look inside the boxes. He didn't open them. Angels don't need to do that. But he went through them carefully. He found some vestments for Mass that looked rather old and worn. Wopsy had hardly finished his inspection when black heads began to peep around the trunks of trees, and black figures dropped down from high branches. Then came the snort of a motor bike. But even before Father George appeared around a bend, all the boxes were back in their places, and a new song was heard. Ah, yah! He was a mighty lion. His roar was like the thunder. His size was the size of an elephant. Ah, yah! He was the mighty one. But he saw Nakapo and Nabuti. He saw Tamba and Sabawo, and he fled into his lair. Ah, yah! He was the mighty one. But we are the great hunters. End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel by Gerard F Scriven, W.F. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 13 The Inquisitiveness of Shiny. Father George's motorbike broke down 3 miles from Matango village, and he couldn't mend it. The angels didn't help at all, for as one of them said, it was Father George's own fault for not bringing a spare piece of string with him this time. Fortunately, several strong, willing men from Matango had gone out to meet the missionary, so they just slung the motorbike on some thick sticks and carried it to the village. Naka Naka was one of the first to greet the missionary with a joyful "yoo-yoos," which is the noise these women make when they are pleased about something. Shiny was there, too, eager to see everything. Wopsy was keeping a close eye on him, for there was no knowing what he might do. Wopsy was just a wee bit sad, because Shiny did not really understand the meaning of Father George's coming to Matango. For even if he was baptized, Shiny had never been taught any catechism. The place for the new mission had already been chosen. It was to be on a little hill outside the village. There was room for a church, a house for the Fathers, and even other buildings. There were big shade trees around, and the ground sloped away to the edge of the forest. The cleared land would make a fine garden with banana trees, beans, manioc, and other things that people eat in Africa. All the boxes were soon carried to the top of the hill, and the motorbike was laid carefully on its side. Then Father George honked the horn as loud as he could, so that everyone heard and came to listen while he made a little speech. He said that the missionaries were coming to Matango to teach the people about God, and that they would also look after the sick and teach the children how to read and write. Then he asked for 10 strong men who were willing to help him build a hut to sleep in for the present. He had many volunteers, and at once sent them off into the forest to cut down branches and tall grasses. The porters were having a rest, telling everyone about the huge lion they had chased away, but they, too, had to get up and help. Shiny, dressed in a nice new piece of bark cloth which Naka Naka had made for the occasion, preferred to stay with Father George, who was preparing to open his cases. Shiny had never seen such wonderful things as were in those cases. From one box there came a big tent, which the porters began to put up. Another contained all kinds of tools. Another had all that was needed for Mass, while a fourth was full of little bottles and boxes, all carefully labeled. A young friend of Shiny's, called Nagomi, was especially interested in this box. While Father George was looking the other way, Nagomi snatched a bottle with something bright and red inside and ran off with it. Shiny thought it was a good idea, so he too took a little box with little pink pills inside. Wopsy tried to stop him, but Shiny wouldn't listen. He put the box under his bark cloth and ran off with it. "Fancy being naughty like that when there aren't even any devils about," said Wopsy reproachfully, but Shiny didn't hear, or at least pretended not to, and ran off after Nagomi. Wopsy flew after them anxiously. He knew there wasn't anything very dreadful in the box or in the bottle, but they mustn't swallow too much of either. Under a big shady tree in the forest the two boys sat down to examine their treasures. Shiny tasted one of his pills, then he gave one to Nagomi. They seemed nice and sweet, so they both swallowed 3 in no time, and might have gone on swallowing them if Shiny hadn't sucked one for a change and found out that the pill was as bitter as anything inside. Then they tried the bottle, but one sip from that made them throw it away as far as they could, which was just as well. Wopsy was sitting nearby, thinking of the Mass they were going to have next morning, and telling God that Shiny didn't really mean to be naughty and was after all rather small. Shiny and Nagomi did not like to go back to the village and to Father George just in case he had missed the bottle in the box, so they played hide and seek on the edge of the forest for a bit. Before long, however, Shiny sat down on a tree trunk and began rubbing his stomach. Nagomi laughed at him at first, but soon he, too, sat down and began to cry. Very quietly at first, then louder and louder, until the birds hurried away, frightened. Just then Naka Naka, who had missed Shiny, came along the path. She found them both rolling their big eyes and complaining that they had fire inside. It wasn't really fire, only a very bad stomach ache, but it seemed terrible to Naka Naka. Wopsy flew down and began whispering to Shiny's mother. He was reminding her that once upon a time Father George made Shiny better when he was badly burned outside, and suggested that perhaps the Bwana could help now that her boy was burned inside. Naka Naka picked up the 2 little boys, tucked one under each arm, and set off to see Father George. She found him looking over his medicine bottles and wondering what had happened to one of them and to a little box of pills. As soon as he saw Shiny and Nagomi, he asked them what they had eaten. With floods of repentant tears the truth came out. Father George was not cross. In fact, he laughed and said the pink pills were meant for pale persons and not for little Negro boys. Then he went to the box and took out some more pills, black ones this time. He made them each take one and sent them both home to bed. Early next morning 2 small boys, looking not quite so black as usual, woke up to find that the pains had gone, and before nightfall they were running about just as usual. Neither of them, however, went near Father George's boxes again. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel by Gerard F Scriven, W.F. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 14. Wopsy pays a visit to heaven. One evening, while Father George was saying his prayers outside his hut and Shiny was sleeping peacefully, Wopsy looked up to a silvery moon that was already peeping from between clouds. Suddenly he knew, as angels do, that God was calling him. It must be important, for God was using the beautiful long name that no one else could pronounce. At once Wopsy flew up high above the little brown huts of Matangu, high above the great trees of the forest, higher even than the mountains far off on the horizon, until the world looked like a great top spinning slowly round. On the way to heaven he passed hundreds and hundreds of angels going up and down with messages, taking things up to heaven and bringing things down to the world, each one with some particular job to do. Some were guardian angels going up to report, others were archangels with special messages to bishops and kings. There were angels called principalities who look after whole districts, others called virtues, who keep the volcanoes boiling, stir up the storms, and shake the world to make earthquakes, and some called powers, whose special job it is to deal with important devils. Wopsy greeted them all respectfully as he passed, but in less than no time he was in heaven. He first met crowds of other little angels with whom he used to play before he became a guardian angel. "Wopsy, Wopsy," they cried, "tell us all about little Shiny." But Wopsy just smiled and told them they would have to wait a while, as he had to go straight to God about something. On he flew, past the wise cherubim, very important angels these, on to where seraphim were shining like great suns, and to where the thrones ministered to God on His mighty throne. As he came near to God, Wopsy's wings trembled with joy and happiness, and he poured out all his angel love for God. Then he knelt down, bowing very low among the thrones, with the great seraphim shining, almost burning, all round him. He felt very awed at being so near God, and yet not a bit shy, for angels are never shy with God. Then he looked at God, and God spoke to him. God didn't use any words, but Wopsy knew at once all that God meant to tell him. God told him many things that he was very glad to hear. First of all, God explained how the bishop had prayed to the guardian angels, and how the bishop's own angel had brought his prayers to God. Because it was a good prayer, God meant to grant it from the first, but he thought it would be rather nice if it was done through the guardian angels. So he chose Wopsy to be a guardian angel and to manage everything. Without knowing this, Wopsy had done just what God wanted. Then came a lot about Shiny. You will remember the dreams Wopsy had had for Shiny, which he had kept secret for himself. They were only dreams, for even angels do not know what God intends to do for people. But now God was telling him, and Wopsy was full of happiness. God was saying that he must take very good care of Shiny, for he wanted him to be a priest one day like Father George, so that he could say Mass and hold God in his hands and forgive people their sins. But Wopsy must be very careful, for some day the devils would guess this, and then there would be trouble. Other things, too, God told him, but they were secrets between God and Wopsy. Wopsy was so pleased and happy that he could hardly keep from dancing there at the very throne of God. He did praise and thank God as hard as he could, until finally he had to make way for other angels who also wanted to come to the throne of God. Wopsy went off to see the other little angels who were so interested in all he had to tell them about Shiny and about the new mission at Matangu, about the poor old man and the devils. Having always been in heaven, these angels had never had any direct contact with devils, and it all seemed terribly exciting. They would all have been very jealous, if angels could be jealous. But you see, angels are always quite satisfied with the job they have to do, and that makes things much easier for everybody. Before Wopsy left them, they played a game in which some were guardian angels and others were Negro babies, which soon became one of their favorite games. While Wopsy was in heaven he wanted to get some special advice, so he also went to see some of the powers and asked them about the special devils who try to prevent boys from becoming priests. They told him that there are ever so many big, powerful devils who do no other work, for they consider this the most important job. They warned Wopsy of all the different things these devils might try to do. They would try to make Shiny die young, which made Wopsy tremble all over. Then they might tempt him to do horrible things, like being proud and conceited. They might set the witch doctors and the sorcerers on him. They might try to make him homesick after he had started school, and they might suggest to him all sorts of other things that would sound more attractive than being a priest. Altogether it was a very frightening future, and Wopsy felt quite flustered. But the powers said he needn't worry, as God would certainly help him to look after Shiny. If anything did happen, it would most certainly be through Shiny's own fault. This was undoubtedly true, but it wasn't quite satisfying, so Wopsy went back to the throne of God, knelt down in a quiet corner where he wouldn't be in the way, and prayed as hard as he could for his little boy Shiny. After that he felt much happier and set off back to Matangu. It was evening now, and the busy little guardian angel felt very pleased as he saw Father George sitting quietly outside his hut, smoking his pipe and thinking about things. Wopsy knew that he was planning the mission, making up his mind just where to build his house and the church, and thinking how he would arrange the catechism classes very soon. Wopsy was still happier when he finally caught sight of Shiny sitting in front of his hut. He seemed to be listening to the soft night noises of the forest and watching patches of moonlight. "He is having dreams of his own," thought Shiny. So he quietly folded his little angel wings together and settled himself close beside Shiny and sent a prayer up to God. "Thank you, God, for the good news today about my little boy Shiny being a priest some day. I promise to watch over, guard, and protect him. Thank you, too, God, for sending the missionaries who will help keep Shiny's soul shiny. Good night, God." End of Chapter 14. End of Wopsy, The Adventures of a Guardian Angel by Gerard F Scriven, W.F.